Hi guys, this is Nadia from Imbali Crafts, and today I want to show you how to create coils and how to use them in a pendant. If you haven't already, hit the subscribe button because I upload new stuff on a regular basis. I quite often make PDF tutorials for the videos I put up on here. They also come with kits. I have all sorts of gemstones, square half round wire and beads and all sorts of nice goodies on my website, so I will pop a link below and you can take a gander over and see if there's anything you fancy. Last but not least, we have an awesome wire wrap group, which I will also pop a link below, so take a look and come and join us. Right, let's get started. Right, so to begin with, we need to cut our base wire, and for this I've used quite a thick piece of square wire. As I said in the text there, you can use round as well, but square has got better integrity, and wires that you're going to attach to it also bind better because of the square profile, obviously. So what I'm doing here is I'm creating a V shape to begin with, so make a bend right in the middle of the wire, and then I'm slowly going to shape it into an oval sort of navette looking shape. And I try and make sure that both sides are as symmetrical as possible before I move on to the next step. So just take your time with that. The more symmetrical, the better, obviously. So once you have a shape that you're happy with, I'm going to, or you can go on and bend the wires for the bail like that. It's a little bit uneven here, but you can fix that. So once you've sorted that out, we need to bind the bail wires together. So for that I'm using my half round wire. Again, you can use round. If you don't have it, just go down 1 gauge. So this is 0.6. If you don't have half round, I would probably go 4 mil or so. You can use 6 as well. It's actually not too bad, but it will stick out a little bit more because it's obviously thicker. So what I'm doing here is I'm very slowly wrapping the half round wire around the 2 bail wires like that. You can either rotate the piece like I'm doing here, or you can wrap the wire around the wires, whichever works best for you, and just, you know, practice and see what works and push the weaves together as you go, and then continue until you have enough of a length. So this is what I've got here, and I'm going to slowly finish up, and I've got a little bit of a length left, and the next step is to shape the bail. So I'm always bending the wires forward a little bit so that the resulting loop sits nice and flush above the pendant itself. So I'm going to bend the legs out a little bit so that when I fold the bail or the loop shut, they line up perfectly with the actual frame at the front. So I'm shaping it here and just take my time with that. And then slowly close it off, and that's what it looks like so far. And you can see the legs line up with the actual oval shape. So next we need to create a space for the stone to sit in, and this is one of my mandala focals. I've got these in my shop if you're interested. So I'm bending the wires outwards, and what I'm doing here is I'm going to create a round shape, sort of roughly in the same size as the stone, just a tiny bit smaller, which will act like a cradle almost. So I'm just bending the wires in an inch circle, and I'm using my tools here to help me shape it. And it doesn't need to be exact. You can just roughly get the shape right, and make sure that the stone doesn't actually fall through. So obviously I always work and try and make everything as symmetrical as possible. It doesn't always work that way, but as long as it fits roughly, that's okay. So I've adjusted the shape a little bit, and I'm checking the fit, and I'm quite happy with the shape. And what I'm doing next is bending the remaining wires downwards, and I'm going to attach these to the frame. So obviously with the thicker wire, they're a little bit harder to manipulate than your 1 millimeter or your 0.8. So just take your time with that, because they're a little bit more difficult to work with. So we're going to be attaching these to the frame near the bottom here. So as I said, because they're a little bit harder, I tend to use my tools and kind of pre-shape them before using my pliers to kind of feed them around the frame itself. Now when you're attaching them, always attach them the same way. So here in this instance, the wire is below, the wire is attached below the cross member. So make sure that when you're attaching it on the other side, you do the same thing. So just one wrap is enough. You can do two if you want to, but one will work just fine. So I'm going to bend the wires inwards a little bit before trimming them off, because obviously this will reduce the snag risk on any clothing. Always try and trim off wires away from areas that are exposed so that it doesn't snag on clothing or skin or anything that it could potentially get hooked on. And then I'm just flattening it down with my wires, my pliers, and I'm doing the same on the other side. So satisfied with the fit, just testing that the stone fits. You can always adjust the fit at this stage, but it's okay like that. So next we're going to add some more cross members, which will be used to add some detail to the pendant later on. So I'm feeding these through. The first wire will be attached just above the circle. So I'm needing to open this a little bit. So I'm pressing down the wire. So it's quite important that the backing wire is obviously at the back to create like a cradle for the stone to fit in. So now the 1mm 18 gauge wire fits through that gap, and I'm going to attach it just as I did with the cross members at the bottom. So again, it's slightly thicker than your normal base wires at 1mm, so I'm just using my pliers to help me, and you can see that I am holding my thumb over the other side just so that the wire doesn't slip and the one side doesn't become longer than the other because the wire is being pulled through. So I'm just holding it in place while I adjust the actual wrap with my pliers. And I keep straightening out the wires, and then I can move on to the next side. And I'm going to do the same with the bottom wire as well. So next is the coils. So we're going to create our first coil. Now I've made 2 coils for this pendant. The base wires are all the same length, and the weaving wire or the wrapping wire, the 0.328 gauge, is 1.5 centimeters for the short one and 2 meters for the big one, because we have different sized coils. Now I am using a drill to create my coils. Some people don't like doing that. They prefer to wrap everything by hand, and there's no wrong or right way. You do whatever works best for you. I just like using those because it's a lot quicker to create coils. So I'm attaching my weaving wire to the thinner base, which is your 0.6 mil, which will get wrapped around the larger base, but you'll see in a minute. So I'm having just a very short tail of both of these wires, and I am attaching the initial coil I have made. I'm feeding it inside the chuck before tightening that up, and that will hold everything in place. So I'm just tightening that up some more. And you can see that the 0.328 gauge wire is now loose, and I'm going to be coiling it around the 0.622 gauge wire. So I'm very slow. You have to begin very slowly and hold the wire quite tightly towards the base like so, and just begin slowly. The only problem is with this is that the 0.6 millimeter base wire just keeps flopping around. So a solution that I have found works quite well is to put the base wire through anything really that will hold it steady. In this instance, because I'm doing a video, I've used something movable like this reel of empty wire, or this empty reel of wire, and this will just keep the base wire steady. You can see it works actually quite nicely, and so it won't flop around, and you can create a base coil quite easily like that. You can really use anything. Sometimes I use the handle of my coffee cup, that works quite well. So you just create a length with the drill you can go as fast or as slow as possible. I just find that the slower I go, the more neat the coil will be in the end. And I just keep my thumb very close to the wire end, and that helps it to be quite nice and tight as well. As you can see, it rotates quite beautifully, and it works quite nicely. And just make sure that the wire, the weaving wire, or the coiling wire rather, is nice and loose so it doesn't tighten up as you work. So here you go. So this is about a 13 centimeter initial coil. I don't really know what that is in inches. You can work that out. I think there's converters on Google. So this is the mini, or the first base coil, and I'm now going to attach the small coil onto the larger base wire, which is the 0.820 gauge. And we want to try to have the coil central, so it doesn't really matter in the beginning. It's easier to have a shorter end, so I am attaching my coil to a short end while I hold it in place, and I very slowly wrap the coil around. Now, one thing I have to say about coil length and wire length, I always used to specify how much wire to use for each coil and how long a coil it produces. The only problem is that everybody tends to coil the smaller coil around the large base wire differently. You can coil it by holding the wire in place so that the smaller coil can't slip, if that makes any sense, and that will create a much tighter final coil than as if you would use or let it loose and let the smaller coil slip along the smaller base wire. I hope that all makes sense, but you'll see what I mean when you do it yourself. So once you've finished your larger coil, we're using some leftover 0.328 gauge wire to fill in the gap of that coil. So what I do here is I simply hold the wire with my left hand or your right hand, depending what feels easier for you, and I rotate the finished coil, and that slots the smaller wire in place. It's important that the coil is nice and tight so that the smaller wire doesn't slip in the gap. So that's that, and now we're creating the second coil. You can see here this length is 17 centimeters, so a little bit longer than the first one. So two coils, one is 5 centimeters and the other 6 centimeters. So I've done both of my coils, and I'm going to take the longer coil and I'm going to be attaching it to the frame somewhere near the middle, and I'm wrapping the 0.8 millimeter base wire around the frame, and I'm going to attach this about 3 or 4 times just to make sure that it's got a very snug and tight fit. So just one more time. I won't always show how many times I attached here. I will just mention it, otherwise the video would be like 5 hours long. I'll just try and keep it as educational as possible and short as possible. So the coil's attached, and here I'm showing you how to do one more wrap. And you can see I use my tools quite often for that as well, just to make sure the wrap is nice and tight. So next I've got this coil attached, pulling it tight, and now I'm placing my stone, and the coil will be wrapped around the side of that faceted mandala stone, and this won't really hold it in place just yet, and this is just an initial sort of start to the actual wrap. So I'm feeding my wire through the top of the bale like so, and then I'm going to attach the other end of the coil to the bale, and again I'm using several wraps, 3 or 4, to make sure that it's nice and tight, using my pliers to make sure I pull them tight and then squeeze together. And then after that you can shape it to your liking. Obviously you can adjust. This is just a beginning. You can shape it at a later stage. So next we're going to be attaching the shorter coil. So I'm going to find a space at the top of the stone on the left hand side of the pendant. I'm going to attach the base wire of that coil to the frame on the left. So shaping it through, and at this stage the shape really isn't that critical just yet. We obviously just want to find where it's going to sit and how it's going to be attached. So I'm happy with where it sits. So I'm going to be attaching it to the frame as close to the entry point as possible so that there is the least amount of wiggle room, if that makes sense. The further away the attachment point is, the more chance of the coil to shift or move. So try and attach it where it exits the design. So shaping it, and I'm going to be attaching it to the bottom somewhere. So I'm going to give it a little bit of a shape in an anti-clockwise direction, and satisfied with that. So I'm going to find a point where I'm going to attach it to the frame here near the bottom. At this stage everything is still pretty loose and movable, so nothing, you know, holds things in place. So don't worry if the stone falls out or things don't stay put just yet. This is just an initial stage, so we can shape it now. So next we need to create the first detail with our square wire, and I'm using the bottom left 1mm wire, and I'm shaping it following the first coil going up to the bale. So again, this is very organic, and you can place that coil wherever you like. You may like it on the outside or on the inside, entirely up to you, personal preference. So again, this is quite thick wire, so use your tools for that, and just don't fight it. Just let it work and let it sort of do its own thing. If you force it, it's going to fight back basically. So just use your tools to manipulate it into the right direction, and the more time you take with that, the easier it'll get. And I'm just wrapping it around several times around the bale just to make sure that it's nice and tight. And obviously just remember that the loose end, once it's attached, needs to be hidden away from any snagging areas. So that's what it looks like so far. So next we're going to do the same with the top left square wire. So again, organic shape, so yours is never going to look exactly the same as mine, because obviously there's no sort of set rule on where you're going to place your wire. So just be careful with your tools when you're using them not to squeeze too hard, because especially copper and silver and all those soft metals get marked really easily. So just take your time when you use your tools. You can polish and buff out any marks at a later stage, but obviously, you know, the less you have in the beginning, the easier, or the less work it is at a later stage to clean it up when you're done with the pendant. So the top wire just gets bent around the coil, and like the first one, I'm going to feed it through the bale. Now often it's a lot easier to just cut off some of the wire, because it's easier to feed through a shorter length of wire than a longer one, as you can see here. But I'm quite stingy with my wire. I don't want to cut anything off until I'm 100% sure that I'm not going to be using it again. So that's why I keep saying my pieces always look like an octopus. I say that all the time because I just never cut any wires off in case I use it all the time. Some people like to add in components as they go along. I just keep reusing the same wires in my design, and that's why they look like that. So that's that attached. So the next step is to get rid of those wires at the back, and as I said before, just make sure you trim them off inside the bale. So I tend to squeeze them together with a pair of pliers, and just to make sure everything's nice and tight, and then I'm going to trim off a bit at the top, and the remaining wires will then just be bent over the bale with a pair of pliers, because that way I've got more control over where I'm going to place the wires and how tight they sit. But as I said, everybody has their own sort of techniques with that. You're going to develop yours, and that's what it looks like so far. So next we're going to create swirl with the right hand 1mm 18 gauge wire. So you just need to make sure that when you are doing the twisting that the wires are flat. So I'm just kind of adjusting the way the wire sits so that I have a flat surface and not a slight twist in the square wire, which can be a pain sometimes when working with that profile because it loves to twist and give you an uneven shape. So just try and keep it straight using pliers, and I'm going to manipulate the wire very gently, trying not to mark it, and I'm going to feed it through a gap in between the stone and the coil and find a gap in the frame and feed it through. Again, you have to be really gentle at this stage, not to mark the wire and not to twist it, and definitely not scratch the stone. So definitely something that you just take your time with and do it slowly. It's a little bit haphazard here because I'm trying to do this while I am looking through the camera, which sometimes can be a little bit difficult to do. So this is how I do it generally. So I very gently feed the wire through, and I make the coil smaller as I go along with a flick of my wrist, and then I very gently pull on the other side, and I never do any jerky movements or fast sort of pulling, because that can distort everything and bend everything out of shape. So when I'm happy with this sort of initial placement, I fine-tune and I arrange the swirl with my pair of pliers, and I haven't attached the wire at this point. I'm still adjusting, and this can be quite a slow process, but you've got the ability to shape it to your liking until you're satisfied. So far so good. So next I am using my round nose pliers, because those will mark those square wires much less, and you've got a lot more control to get a nice round swirl. So once I'm happy with the fit, I'm going to attach that square wire to the frame. So for that, again, I am shaping it, and I really should have cut off a little bit of the wire to make the attaching easier, because as I said earlier, the shorter the wire that you're trying to attach to the frame, the easier it is to manipulate it, I find anyway. And I'm using my pliers to very gently coax the wire through the frame, and there's no set point where to attach it, as long as it's nice and tight. One wrap is enough to make sure it's attached to the frame. So that's what it looks like. So happy with the fit, and I'm going to trim off that extra wire, as I said before. Make sure that it's trimmed off nice and tight, and then I'm manipulating the remaining bit of wire to fit within the frame so that the cut end doesn't stick out anywhere. So that's what it looks like so far. So next I'm going to create a detail at the bottom, and this is the remaining square wire at the bottom, and I am coiling it in like so into a clockwise direction over the stone again. Get an initial shape, and I'm going to very gently feed it again in between the stone and the coil and find a gap in the frame before I feed it through to the back. And again, as I said earlier, just be very gentle with the square wires, because they love to twist, and then it doesn't look quite as nice as it would if you've got a flat profile. So pulling it through, and you can see me jiggling the wire very slightly. It makes me think of that song that's going around TikTok at the moment. Don't worry, I'm not going to sing it. Right, so adjusting it, and I am giving it a slight twist. You can see here I'm using my round nose pliers, and I am using that, I'm twisting it to get a shape, and I love doing this because it's very satisfying to get a nice coil. And again, as I said, do this really slowly, take your time, no fast sort of movements, and you can adjust later on. So happy with that. So now I've attached the wire to the back. worth of coil, and I'm going to trim this off again nice and tight. And now we're going to create a few details at the back and the front. So twisty bits. So I'm going to create a clockwise swirl, and I'm going to place it at the bottom of the smaller coil, and I'm going to fit it inside the swirl like so, and I'm going to be attaching it to the frame. The wire I'm using here is the wire of the coil, the base wire of the coil, the 0.8 millimeter 20 gauge wire, and I'm using that to create the detail at the coil like so. And you can just manipulate it with a pair of pliers once it's attached. So next I'm using that wire to wrap around the frame several times. So you just need to try and find the gap somewhere. The busier the design, the harder it is to try and find the gap where to attach the wire. The important part is to always stay neat, as neat as you can, even when you are working on the back, because obviously the back is as important as the front in my opinion, so the neater the better. So always try and find a space where it'll look good, even if it's the back of the pendant. So just wrap this several times and make sure it's all attached. And that is the first little detail here at the bottom. And next we're going to be trimming that wire off again, nice and tidy. All right, so now we're going to create the next detail. So we're going to use the remaining 0.8 20 millimeter wire, and we're going to create a detail within the swirl that we have created with the 1 millimeter 18 gauge wire. So again, I'm feeding it through, and you try and find a space within the frame to feed it through, and watch me very carefully feed the wire through. I don't pull it tight to begin with. I just kind of feed it through so that I have a placement like so, very gently, because what I want to do is create another swirl within that larger swirl. So I'm using my round nose pliers and leave a little bit of a space, because that will enable me to create a swirl that will neatly fit into that 1 millimeter wire swirl that we have created earlier. And as I said earlier, just take your time with that. Adjust the fit and the size and where it lies until you're satisfied, and then you can attach it to the frame. So you can see I'm using a variety of tools to adjust the wire, and just be careful not to scratch the wire obviously, and then attach to the frame. So I'm happy with that, and I am going to manipulate it some more, and you can see me here pushing that newly created swirl into the existing swirl, and I'm going to attach that wire to the frame multiple times so it can't move. So again, you need to try and find a gap here, and as I said earlier, the more you have added to your pendant, the harder it will get to manipulate the wire and attach it somewhere. So you can see me here fighting to find a space here to feed the wire through, and then the wire tends to look a little bit mangled at this stage. That's where you cut it off and, you know, use a new piece for new designs. You can also smooth it out quite easily if you wanted to, but generally I just tend to cut it off. Right, so the last detail, so I'm using the remaining 8 millimeter wire, and I'm going to do exactly the same thing. So I'm feeding this wire through the bottom swirl, and I'm going to use my pliers to feed it in very slowly until it fits into that gap. And this one should be a little bit easier because there's more space. And then obviously don't pull too hard, and you can just very slowly feed the wire through and manipulate it like so, and then attach it to the frame at the bottom. You can see how easy it is to manipulate that wire, and take your time with that. Gently squeeze and shape with your pliers, and then at the very end I tend to use my round nose pliers And then obviously attach to the frame when you're quite sure that you have got enough wire to get the shape you want. So I've got this ready, and I'm going to attach it to the frame. We've got a nice gap here on the side because that was space where we hadn't added anything in yet, and you can see I gently pull until I'm happy, and I keep my thumb over the swirl at all times when I'm doing that so that there's no chance of it moving. And then I adjust and fit the swirl into the bigger swirl. And that's what it looks like so far. So obviously wrap it a couple of times, double check that everything fits properly. So I'm quite happy with the shape so far, and I'm going to decide what to do next. So we've got the 0.6 wire from the coil that I hadn't cut off either. And I'm going to bring that up to the top. Now, if you don't have this wire, no sweat. You can just cut a new piece of 0.6 millimeter wire. And we're going to attach it somewhere to the top of the frame, because we're going to be using that to add the beads. So I'm just bringing it up to the top. So it doesn't look very tidy like that, but we will trim it off later. So I'm just bringing it up and adding it to the frame. So next I'm going to position it so that I am ready to attach my beads. So I'm wrapping it around the 1mm 18 gauge wire that we have created a swirl with earlier, and then I'm adding my beads. So I'm starting with the largest one because it will fit into the gap, and I'm going smaller until the whole gap, until the coil's filled. So then I'm feeding that wire through in between the swirl like so, and I pull it tight. So obviously it depends, you know, what gap, what size you have, and it will look slightly different to mine. So just judge that and add as you want, and then obviously add this wire to the frame. So happy with that. So I'm going to trim off all these wires. So earlier I brought this 0.6 22 gauge wire up to the top. So I'm just going to get rid of that sort of bridging, and I'm going to cut that off so that it doesn't look quite so ugly from the back. So then I'm just using some of the remaining wires from the top, and I'm going to shape this just as an added detail to the pendant itself. So this is one of the 0.8mm wires, the 20 gauge from the first coil, and I'm just shaping it then attached to the frame. And lastly, my favorite bit is adding the accent pieces. There is a video that I will pop a link below in the description where I show you how to make this lollipop or coiled setting for these stones. And then we're just going to be adding these in all the gaps, one at the bottom, one at the top, and attached to the frame somewhere. So doing the same with the top, and we're just going to press them into place and attach to the frame. Now obviously these ones, the top one especially, is slightly exposed. So once you have attached the wires to the frame, we're going to trim them off. But before I do that, I tend to use one of the wires and I'm wrapping it around the setting itself to give it a little bit more reinforcing. So I'm just very tightly wrapping it. And this just gives it a little bit more structure, because otherwise it would be quite floppy, as there's, you know, too much openness, if that makes sense. So trim off all the wires. And last, if you want to, you can dip it into live-off sulfur and give it a good polish. Obviously be very careful not to go over the stones. Always maintain a gap, because otherwise you'll scratch them and they become dull. And it doesn't look very nice. So just be gentle with those and just go over the metal if you can. You get some liquid silicone which you could put over them, but I tend to be just very gentle with where I put the polishing disc, so it doesn't damage the stones. So just keep polishing until you're satisfied with the results. And yeah, that's it. That's the whole pendant done. Hope you enjoyed this, and thank you so much for watching. Obviously don't forget to hit the subscribe button, because I upload new stuff on a regular basis. I would absolutely love it if you could visit me on my social media. I've got Instagram, TikTok, Facebook. Obviously you know about my YouTube channel. Come and join us in our Wire Wrappers group, which is called Wire Wrappers and Metalsmiths Worldwide on Facebook. We're a fun bunch. We do challenges every month, and it's an absolutely all-round awesome group with awesome people. And as I said, I have got all sorts of goodies on my website, so I will pop a link below. That's it from me.